Hello, and welcome to some Dodge family history. This is where I present information and research on my ancestors who served in the military during the early 20th century. Today, I will be presenting on the military service of Private David Nemetzky, 99th Company, Coast Artillery Corps. We will use records that are available on Family Search, such as unit and post returns, as well as National Archives records, such as medical records, special orders, bi-monthly muster rolls, and Adjutant General's office correspondence to tell the story of this chapter of his military service. I have also found some additional information from newspapers.com that I am incorporating into this revised presentation. Following trial by General Court Martial on June 23, 1904, Private David Nemetzky was found guilty of desertion and sentenced to be dishonorably discharged and confined to hard labor for 6 months. On July 2, 1904, his sentence was reduced to 2 months confinement at hard labor and forfeiture of $10 pay per month for the time of his confinement. Also on July 2nd, a letter from the Adjutant General's office to the commanding officer of Camp Thomas, Georgia, indicated that the department commander desired that Private Nemetzky be transferred from the cavalry to the Coast Artillery, where no mounted service would be required. On July 7, 1904, Private Nemetzky requested transfer to the Coast Artillery Corps, stating that it was for the good of the service. The third endorsement on his request, dated July 12, 1904, recommended that he be transferred to the 99th Company of the Coast Artillery Corps, as this company had the least strength at that time. His transfer was approved, and the order was issued on July 26, 1904. Following completion of his sentence and release from confinement on September 1, 1904, Private David Nemetzky was transferred to the 99th Company of the Coast Artillery Corps. Now briefly, the Coast Artillery Corps was organized in February of 1901 and consisted of 126 numbered companies designed for the protection and defense of America's coasts and harbors in the event of invasion or attack. The Coast Artillery Corps was used during both World Wars and was eventually dissolved in 1950. He left the 7th Cavalry, then stationed at Fort Myer, Virginia, on September 10, 1904, and arrived at Fort Morgan, Alabama, at the mouth of Mobile Bay on September 14th. Only 8 days after reporting for duty at Fort Morgan, Alabama, on September 22, 1904, Private Nemetzky was hospitalized. His hospital card reads, anemia and general debility, probably the result of injury received at Chickamauga Park, Georgia, March 1, 1904, kicked by a horse causing simple fracture, ninth right rib in line of duty, and sprain, slight, right wrist due to fall from horse. It is very likely that the injury he suffered from being kicked by a horse earlier in 1904 was not healing properly. It is also likely that he suffered internal injuries that went undiagnosed or undetected due to the lack of modern medical diagnoses and treatment. He would remain hospitalized for the remainder of 1904 and into the first months of 1905. On March 3, 1905, his commanding officer, Captain Alfred S. Morgan, submitted a certificate of disability for discharge for Private Nemetzky. He recommended discharge of Private Nemetzky due to general debility. Captain Morgan noted that Private Nemetzky joined company on September 14, 1904, but was unable to do duty. Captain Morgan also stated that the cause of Private Nemetzky's debility was unknown, that he became much emaciated, had much pain in abdomen region, great physical weakness, and has been unable to perform the duties of a soldier. The surgeon, William J. Enders, concurred and stated that he found Private Nemetzky was incapacitated for duty because of anemia and general debility, and constant pain in right and left hypochondriac and umbilical region. Owing to general weakness and emaciation, is unable to perform the duties of a soldier. By this time, Private Nemetzky had been hospitalized for 5.5 months. The request for a disability discharge was accompanied by a total of 10 different endorsements. The first and second endorsements of the Certificate of Disability for Discharge state that Private Nemetzky was to be held for further observation and treatment for 1 month, so that a more definite diagnosis of his condition could be made, and transferred to another post made if needed. The third endorsement invited the post surgeon to follow the previous 2 recommendations, which he did. The fourth endorsement, given by the post surgeon, dated April 15, 1905, gave an update on Private Nemetzky's medical condition, and states that this man has made no material improvement, he is suffering from secondary anemia and general debility, and has a great deal of pain in the right and left hypochondriac and umbilical region. If this man were moved to a more bracing climate, or climate that made you feel fresh and full of energy, he would probably improve more rapidly. The fifth endorsement by his commanding officer, however, still recommended his discharge. The seventh endorsement, dated April 20, 1905, recommended that Private Nemetzky be transferred to the Army General Hospital in Washington, D.C. for further observation and treatment. The 10th and final endorsement concurred with the recommendation in the 7th endorsement. On April 26, 1905, Special Order 96 was issued from the War Department, ordering Private David Nemetzky, 99th Company, Coast Artillery, Fort Morgan, Alabama, will be sent to the Army General Hospital, Washington Barracks, District of Columbia, reporting on arrival to the commanding officer for observation and treatment. Private Nemetzky left Fort Morgan, Alabama on May 3, 1905. After more than 7 months in hospitalization at Fort Morgan, it must have been a relief to be transferred to a different environment. Private Nemetzky arrived at the Army General Hospital in Washington, D.C. on May 4, 1905. On May 14th, his diagnosis was corrected to neurasthenia. Merriam-Webster defines this as a condition that is characterized especially by physical and mental exhaustion, usually with accompanying symptoms, such as headache and irritability, is of unknown cause but is often associated with depression or emotional stress, and is sometimes considered similar to or identical with chronic fatigue syndrome. No doubt this was not only related to being injured while in the cavalry, but also the emotional stress of facing a general court-martial and not having his experience in the Army work out the way he expected. The Personal Papers Record Series, housed at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., contained the medical record for David Nemetzky while he was hospitalized at the Army General Hospital. The transfer paper included with his medical record notes his illness, as well as his physical condition at the time he was received at the Army General Hospital, and reads, "The anemia yielded to treatment in April. At present still suffers with pain in the hypochondriac and umbilical regions, and the myalgia, and a moderate degree of insomnia." Between May and July of 1905, Private Nemetzky received medical treatment. On July 17, 1905, following significant improvement to his health, it was recommended by the hospital surgeon that Private Nemetzky return to duty. On July 19, 1905, Special Order 165 was issued by the War Department, which reads, "Private David Nemetzky, 99th Company, Coast Artillery, now at the Army General Hospital, Washington Barracks, District of Columbia, will be sent to his proper station, Fort Morgan, Alabama, reporting upon arrival to the commanding officer for duty." He was discharged from the Army General Hospital on July 25, 1905, and reported back to Fort Morgan the next day, where he was finally able to resume, or begin, depending on how it could be viewed, his duties as a soldier. On December 27, 1905, Private David Nemetzky, along with Private Frank Cooks and First Sergeant Samuel Cash, were sent to Fort Barrancas, Florida, to testify at the General Court-Martial of Private James H. Conway. Private Conway had re-enlisted in January of 1905 and been assigned to the 99th Company of the Coast Artillery. On November 3, 1905, Private Conway deserted from the Army and was apprehended by civil authorities on November 15, 1905. Private Conway was transferred to Fort Barrancas on December 27, 1905. At the General Court-Martial, Private Conway was found guilty of going AWOL and sentenced to 2 months' confinement at hard labor. Following the General Court-Martial and completion of the sentence, Private Conway returned to his company of April of 1906. Although called as a witness, Private David Nemetzky was not called on to testify and returned to Fort Morgan on January 13, 1906. On March 14, 1906, Private David Nemetzky was transferred from the Coast Artillery Corps to the Hospital Corps and assigned for duty at Fort Morgan, Alabama. Special Order 35, Department of the Gulf, reads, "Private David Nemetzky, 99th Company, Coast Artillery, Fort Morgan, Alabama, is transferred as a private to the Hospital Corps, under the provision of paragraph 1440, Army Regulations, and assigned to duty at that post." Army Regulation 1440 reads in part, "Enlisted men may be transferred to the Hospital Corps as privates by the commander of a division, separate brigade, or department, on the application of the surgeon of the post or command, forwarded through military channels. The application will state the age, character, physical condition, and habits of the soldier, date of expiration of current enlistment, and whether made for an existing or prospective vacancy." I have always wondered why he transferred to the Hospital Corps, and this special order helps explain why. Now, many of the special orders that were issued are housed at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and provide context to military service. I've also had the thought that it is possible that his experience as a patient also played a role in his transfer to the hospital corps. On September 27, 1906, a severe hurricane struck Fort Morgan, Alabama. The Birmingham Post-Herald from September 30, 1906 reports, "The storm began at the fort on Wednesday night, and at 8:30 o'clock the water began coming up to the hospital, the waves washing over the seawall, and about 9 o'clock it could be seen roaring over the South Beach mountain high. The water in a short time cut a channel through the officers' quarters a mile wide and 15 feet deep. There was no part of the reservation that was not under water except the hospital. The roof of the hospital held until late Wednesday night when the wind blew it off. The people who were quartered there when the rain came in Thursday morning were compelled to go to the first floor, and from that time until Thursday morning, the soldiers swept water out of the place. Damage to Fort Morgan was estimated to be $100,000. Orders were received for Fort Morgan to be abandoned, and all soldiers, including the hospital corps, were transferred to Fort Moultrie, South Carolina. Private Nemetzky left Fort Morgan on November 9, 1906, and arrived at Fort Moultrie, South Carolina on November 12. In December of 1906, he requested permission to re-enlist in the Army Hospital Corps and be assigned to Fort Wayne, Michigan. The only evidence of this correspondence is the Adjutant General's Office Correspondence Index card. Looking through the Adjutant General's Office correspondence housed at the National Archives of Washington, D.C., this piece of correspondence no longer exists. There is also no indication that this request was approved or otherwise acted on by the Army. Private Nemetzky was to have been discharged in January of 1907, following the expiration of his term of service. However, per Army Regulation 129, he was held over until May 28, 1907, to make up the time that was lost from his desertion back in 1904. Army Regulation 129 reads, in part, "A deserter who surrenders before his term of enlistment has expired, and if he is subsequently restored to a duty status, he will serve for such period as will, with the time he may have served prior to his desertion, amount to the full term for which he enlisted." Private Nemetzky was honorably discharged on May 28, 1907, from Fort Moultrie, South Carolina, as a private in the hospital corps with a good character rating. Even with his desertion and good character, there was no objection to his re-enlisting in the Army. Following his honorable discharge, Private Nemetzky re-enlisted on June 3, 1907, and was assigned to Company B, 12th Infantry Regiment. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation and found it informative. From facing a dishonorable discharge to a possible disability discharge, to extended illness and hospitalization, and being transferred from the cavalry to the coast artillery to the hospital corps, the first 3 years and 4 months of Private Nemetzky's military service certainly weren't what he expected. The National Archives at Washington, D.C., as well as available records online at Family Search, Fold3, and Ancestry, have preserved much of the story of his early military service. As a quick explanation, I recently spent time at the National Archives of Washington, D.C., looking up many of the available special orders, bi-monthly musters, and personal papers in order to provide additional information on this chapter of his military service. The next presentation will look at his re-enlistment and service in Company B, 12th Infantry Regiment. Thank you.